Good morning, church. Today's scriptures are in Mark 14, verses 66 through 72. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You are also with the Nazarene Jesus." But he denied it, saying, "I neither nor understand what you mean." And he went out into the crowd, into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. And after a little while the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept.
So, I don't know about all of you, but I hate throwing up. Anybody? Anyone just hate it? Don't you hate throwing up? I mean, I hate getting sick, like of any kind of sickness. You know, just you get a scratch in your throat, and immediately just that little itch makes you wonder, like, if your entire week is going to be derailed. You know what I'm talking about? You know, is this just allergies, and I just need to take an antihistamine? Or is this going to be full-blown? You know, sore throat, cough, wheeze, chest cough, fever. Am I going to have to, call John or Al and have them preach for me on Sunday? I mean, you know what it's like. Like when you get sick, it's the worst, right? But throwing up, right, that is the worst of the worst. That feeling when you're running and you're hoping that you can make it to the bathroom in time, you know what I'm talking about? It's the worst feeling of all, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I cannot stand throwing up. Today we are finishing our series called Following Jesus. Next week on Easter Sunday, we're going to kick off a new series on the book of 1 Peter. But today we're finishing this series out of the Gospel of Mark called Following Jesus. And we've just been exploring over the last 6 weeks, what does this look like to follow Jesus? And I'm going to get right to the heart of this passage. We're going to get right into it. And we see a number of things that emerge from the story that was read about what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus and often what that entails. And a crucial observation emerges from this passage. Here's what it is. All followers of Jesus will turn away at some point. Now, this is just a sober reality. All followers of Jesus will at some point turn away. Today is Palm Sunday, right? We celebrate that the week of Jesus' crucifixion, the Sunday before, he came into Jerusalem and he was hailed as king. And the crowds, they praised him and they celebrated this incredible reality that this king that they had been longing for hundreds of years seemed to have emerged in Jesus. And they laid down the palms as a way of worshiping him, celebrating his presence. And within less than a week, every single one of them would turn away. And they would cry out, "Crucify him." Not just the crowds, but Jesus' closest friends and followers, all 12 of the disciples, turn away from Jesus. Of course, it begins with Judas. We read this here in chapter 14. In fact, in all of chapter 14, we see the betrayal of the 12 disciples. Here it is in chapter 14, verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And there we read it. He goes and he offers to hand over Jesus. And he's paid money to betray Jesus because the authorities, both the religious and the civil authorities, were getting nervous. It was the season of Passover, and Passover was always a dangerous time in Jerusalem. The Roman prefect, who usually lived in Caesarea on the coast, he would always come into town around Passover to just kind of make sure things didn't get out of control, because Israel had a history of religious hotheads forming revolutions and rebellions, and they wanted to make sure that they had the power there to put anything down that might get out of underhand. And so the authorities, they're looking, okay, if there's somebody who's maybe stepping out of line or we think might be a problem, yeah, hand them over to us. And so Judas knew that. And so Judas agreed to hand Jesus over. But it's not just Judas that betrays Jesus. We see when the authorities come, when Judas leads the authorities to Jesus, right as he's coming out of the Garden of Gethsemane. Let me read this passage for you, and I want you to notice especially the last line, the last thing that is said. And they laid hands on him, Jesus, and seized him. And Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled. And then notice this. And they all left him and fled. All of his disciples, they turn away from him. Now Peter, I suppose to his credit, right, he ends up then kind of turning back and following Jesus at a distance. But then as we saw in the passage that was just read, even Peter himself turns away. I want you to think about that. The 12 disciples, every single one of them turned away from Jesus. Think about who these individuals were. These were the individuals who had been with Jesus throughout his 3 years of ministry. These are individuals who had seen firsthand the power of God manifested through him. They had firsthand seen the miraculous. Remember, during the season of Epiphany, we did a series called See the Miraculous, and we looked at these stories where the power of God was manifested through Jesus in miraculous ways. Of course, in each of these situations, the disciples were right there with him. They were there when he healed a man who had been paralyzed. They were there when he fed the thousands of people, took just a little bit of food, some bread and some fish, and turned it into enough food to feed the thousands. They were there with him when he helped a little girl who had been pronounced dead and brought her back to life. But they were right there with him, observing all of this, and yet they still turned away. And I think that's really important for us to realize, because I think sometimes we might catch ourselves saying things like this, you know, if only I could have seen Jesus do his miracles, right? If only I'd been there to observe firsthand the things that Jesus did, boy, I would have really strong faith. Well, the Gospels challenge that. And what they reveal to us is that no matter who you are, every follower of Jesus will at some point turn away. Now, as a side note, I think it's worth highlighting the fact that the gospel accounts, all four of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all record Peter's betrayal of Jesus, which I think is really interesting, and I would say it's one of the many pieces of evidence that just point to the credibility of the New Testament in terms of it being a historical source. Because the question you have to ask yourself, some have tried to say over the centuries that the Gospels are stories that were made up later on. You can't trust the history of them and whatnot. But the thing you have to ask yourself is, why would they make this up? Why would Peter, who becomes one of the primary leaders of the church, why would he allow them to include a story of him looking so bad? In the ancient world, the victors, they usually wrote their histories. The religious leaders and the political leaders of the day, they would write their histories. And what you find in ancient history is that whenever they write their own history, they always look really good. They'll cover up their blemishes and their flaws, and they'll just celebrate all the great things about them. the last thing they're going to do is make up stories that make them look bad. And so here, the only reasonable explanation for this story is that it really happened. So as a side note, this is just one of the many pieces of evidence that support the historical reliability of the Gospels. But for our purposes today, right, the primary point here is for us to recognize that all followers will at some point turn away. So, what does this mean? It means don't be surprised when you see people who claim to follow Jesus turning away. Now, how often do we say things like, I cannot believe he did that? And he calls himself a Christian. Maybe you even said that of your husband this morning. I don't know. Now, how many of us have said that? I can't believe she said this or did that, and yet they call themselves a Christian. Friends, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised because every single one of us will turn away. Don't be surprised when others turn away from Jesus. And don't be surprised when you turn away from Jesus. Don't be surprised when you sin. In fact, those who think that they are above turning away from Jesus are precisely the ones who are most likely to fall the hardest. And Peter is the quintessential example of this. The severity and the dramatic nature of his denial is matched only by the severity and the dramatic nature of his resolution that he would never turn away. Notice what Peter says. Jesus actually, earlier on, he tells the disciples, he predicts this, that they will turn away from him. And notice how Peter responds when Jesus says this. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, you will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Notice Peter. Peter said to him, even though they all fall away, I will not. I mean, look, everything Peter does, he does with gusto. When he betrays with gusto. When he claims that he won't, he does so with gusto. You see, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to have the pride that says, I won't fall, because those who convince themselves they won't are the most likely to fall the hardest. So, 25 years ago, I was living in Loveland, Colorado, just north of here, and I was serving as the music minister for Faith Church. And when I look back on that experience, I'm incredibly grateful. I was in my early 20s. It was my first time serving in a church in an official capacity. And I look back on those years now, in hindsight, realizing how blessed I was to serve under the leadership at that church. In particular, the lead pastor, Jim Murphy, and the youth pastor, Jim Ing, both seasoned ministers at the time I was there. And in hindsight, I'm just so grateful that was my first experience, because I know of others that maybe haven't had that kind of experience when they first serve in the church. So I look back on that with great memories. But I remember one memory in particular that I have was the three of us going out to lunch. And on the drive back, I'm sitting in the back, right? I'm the new kid. They're the I respect my elders. And so the two Jims, the senior pastor and the youth pastor, they're both sitting in the front seat. And Jim Ing, the youth pastor, who'd been doing ministry for many, many years, he brought up this tragic fact, that he had heard that another pastor in the community had fallen into an adulterous affair with another member of the church. And then I listened to the two Jims, and they were talking about just the fallout that this was having, just how devastating it was on the church and on the community. And then Jim Ing, I'll never forget what he said. He said, but guys, remember this. None of us are above that. That could happen to any one of us. I remember sitting there in my 20s just looking at these two men, just like, what? But then I realized, no, this is right. This is the humility that is required. You see, when you think you're above something, then you tend to put your guard down. When you think you're above something, then you're actually much more likely to fall into it in the first place. This is what we see in the story of Peter. Every single one of us will eventually, in some way or another, or many times, turn away from Jesus. The second observation that we can see about the nature of sin is this: sin tends to escalate. If you give sin an inch, it will take a mile. And we see this in the way the story of Peter's denial unfolds. And what we discover is that there is an escalation to his denial. Now, this does not come through that well in the Gospel of Mark. But if you look in the Gospel of Matthew, which tells the same story, there are some interesting details that emerge where you see a progression and an escalation to Peter's denial. Notice this. I'm going to read essentially the same passage, but as it's covered in the Gospel of Matthew. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him. And he said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. You see the escalation to his denial. First he just says, "I don't know the man." And then by the third denial, he's putting a curse on himself. Probably what this means is he said something like, "I'll be damned if I know who Jesus of Nazareth is." And think about that. And think about how probably just a few minutes before, he would never have imagined that he would say that. Could never have dreamed that he would end up saying, "I'll be damned if I know who Jesus of Nazareth is." But what happened? You see, sin loves to escalate. Sin is in many respects, well, it's like a ladder. Imagine you're standing on a ladder, and it's a ladder that, well, goes down to hell. And it's a ladder, and there are a number of different rungs on the ladder. Now, if you're standing on a ladder, and you look down to like 3 or 4 rungs below, it seems pretty impossible to jump down to that rung, right? That seems kind of hard to do. But if you go down one rung, and then another rung, all of a sudden making it to that third rung is not nearly as difficult, is it? It's much more natural. And the same thing is true with sin. Look, I don't know this for sure, but I'm just guessing that most bank robbers don't start by robbing a bank. My guess is it maybe starts by taking some money out of their mom's purse. And then they go to school and they take a little bit of money out of their teacher's wallet or purse, right? One little step down as it begins to escalate. I would imagine that most who find themselves in affairs don't just jump into an affair. There are tiny little steps that lead in that direction. We see this in the story of Peter, that sin has a tendency to escalate. Okay, so the question is this, and this is really where we're getting to what I would suggest is the main theme of this passage. And that is that if we acknowledge the inevitability of sin, we will all turn away at some point or many points. The question becomes, how do we respond in the face of our sin? And what I want to suggest is that the Gospels offer us 3 different approaches to our sin. These 3 different approaches are seen in 3 different characters that emerge throughout the Gospel stories. In other words, we're going to see there's 3 different approaches. There's the approach of the Pharisees, there's the approach of Judas, and then there's the approach of Peter. All 3 of them are responding to sin in a particular way. We'll start with the Pharisees. In other words, if we embody the Pharisees and their approach to sin, here's what it is. We don't accept or even acknowledge our sin. So the Pharisaical mindset is one where they don't accept, they don't even acknowledge that such sin is present in their lives. Jesus draws this out in a parable that he tells about a Pharisee in Luke chapter 18. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. You see, that's what it is. This is the mindset where all you see is the good things that you do, and you see the bad things that everybody else does. I remember when I was a kid, I had this game where it had like a bunch of cards that had pictures on them, images on them. But these cards that had images on them all had a bunch of red lines going over the pictures, such that you couldn't really make out the picture very well. However, if you put on a set of red tinted glasses, anybody remember these kinds of games? You put on the red tinted glasses, and it screens out the red lines, and so now the picture looks great, okay? What I would say is that this is what the Pharisee does with their life. They put on a kind of lens that screens out their own sin, okay? But they see the sin of everybody else. And of course, you can have different colored glasses. You could have glasses that screen out red. You could have glasses that screen out green. You could have glasses that screen out blue. I mean, there's many different ways to be a Pharisee. The Pharisaical mindset is just one where you're really good at screening out your own sin, minimizing it, justifying it, but seeing the sin in everyone else. So let me give you an example of how this might work. I want to introduce you to two Pharisees, one by the name of Bob and one by the name of Steve. Okay, we've got Bob the Pharisee and we've got Steve the Pharisee. Now let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Bob, let me start with Steve. Okay, Steve, I don't know why it makes a difference, but I'm going to start with Steve. All right, so Steve, here's the thing about Steve. Steve is incredibly generous with his money and with his time. But Steve has a tendency to curse like a sailor. And he'll often not say things that are very nice. He's kind of abrupt. He's kind of abrasive. Okay, so that's Steve. Okay, now Bob is the total opposite. Bob, he always says the right thing. He would never say a swear word, right? But he wouldn't give 2 pennies to help his starving grandmother. Okay? So that's Bob and that's Steve. Now here's the thing. They both wear different glasses. So Bob, right, all he sees in Steve is his foul mouth. Oh, that guy shouldn't be in church. Look at that guy. He's always saying terrible things. What a sinner, right? Screening out, right, the fact that Steve is actually, really kind with his money. And then what does Steve do? Steve does the other thing, right? He puts on his glasses, and all he notices is that Bob is incredibly ungenerous. You see, this is the Pharisaical mindset, but here's the reality. Don't we all kind of do this? We have a tendency to screen out our own sin and see the sin in others. I'm going to use one other example of this, and my hope is to offend all of you, okay? That's the stated goal here. If I only offend some of you, I don't think I've been faithful to Jesus. So here's what it is, and I'm going to do it by getting political. I'm going to talk about immigration. Are you guys excited? Okay, here we go. So here's just the truth. Here, I would say, is the truth. Both the political left and the political right often are very Pharisaical in the way they approach things. It's just the truth. So here's the reality. Those on the left, here's what they do when they look at the issue of immigration. They screen out the importance of the rule of law. They screen out the importance of following the law. You should follow the rules. They are compassionate towards the immigrant, but they screen out the importance of following rules. Now, those on the right do the very opposite. It's all about rule of law. You got to follow the law, and they screen out the importance of compassion. You see this? Good, you're all offended. This is how the Pharisaical mindset works. We screen out our own sin, and we see the sin of others. And what this allows us to do then, right, is the Pharisaical mindset is we don't accept or even acknowledge our own sin. That's one way in which we can respond in the face of our sin. Then there's a second way in which we can respond in the face of our sin, and this is seen in Judas. And when we bring in Judas's perspective, here's how we approach sin. We acknowledge, but pridefully refuse to accept our sin. You see this? We acknowledge that we are sinful, but we refuse to accept it. So in the Gospel of Mark, the last time that we hear about Judas is when he hands Jesus over to be betrayed. But once again, in the Gospel of Matthew, we are given a little bit more of the story. And we discover there's more to what Judas does. And let me read to you what we find in Matthew 27. Here's what it says. Then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed and he went and he hanged himself. Now, what's going on here with Judas? Judas acknowledges his sin. He says that. He realized that he has sinned. But in his pride, he can't come to terms with that. He can't accept that he's a sinner. So he's saying to himself, I'm not like that. I'm better than that. But the silver is sitting there in his hands saying, no, well, that actually is what you're like, Judas. I'm not like that. Well, no, here I am. And he wants to get rid of the silver. He wants to get rid of any evidence that might suggest that he actually is that way, because in his pride, he can't come to terms with it. You see, I think some of us are this way. If you've ever said to yourself, I will never forgive myself for what I've done. Ever said that? You look back on your own life, you look back on mistakes that you have made, and you say, I will never forgive myself of that. What's going on? Here's the truth. I would suggest it might be pride. Because pride says, I can't accept that. I mean, you see it, you acknowledge the reality of it, but in your pride, you can't come to terms with the fact, guess what? You are a sinner. You've acknowledged it, but you can't accept it. And what happens, it just eats you up inside. I think there are many who really, they go through their entire lives just this internal conflict because they acknowledge their sin, but they can't in humility come to terms with that. That's the second way in which we can respond to our sin. But there's a third way. And that is the way of Peter. What does Peter do? Or what do we do when we embody Peter's approach? We acknowledge, or he acknowledges and humbly accepts his sin. So here he both acknowledges his sin, but he's also willing to accept it. And what does it do? It breaks him. It brings him to his knees, brings him before the mercy of God. And in the end, friends, this is what leads to life. Mark 14:72. And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright sums up Peter's approach this way. Peter's tears at the end of this story are the main thing that distinguish him from Judas in the next chapter. There is all the difference in the world between genuine repentance and mere remorse. The one leads to life, the other to death. Peter's tears, shaming, humiliating, and devastating though they were a sign of life. See, friends, at the heart of what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? It's humble confession. It's coming before our God and acknowledging our sin, acknowledging what we have done. It is laying ourselves completely at the mercy of God. We see this is ultimately what leads to life. Peter goes on to become a leader in the church. What is it that makes him a leader and not Judas? It's his humility. It's his willingness to acknowledge his sin, to confess it, to bring it before the Lord. But here's the thing. We don't like to confess our sin, do we? It's ugly. It's messy. It's painful. We like confessing our sin about as much as we like throwing up. I mentioned at the beginning of this message that I don't like throwing up. But here's the thing. Isn't it true that as terrible as throwing up is, sometimes it's actually what leads to relief? That the actual feeling and experience of throwing up is terrible. But oftentimes it's kind of what you have to do to be freed of the sickness that was in you. Friends, we are all sick. We are all sick with sin. And the way in which we get out of that is through confession. As messy and as painful as it is ultimately what leads to life. Of course, why does it lead to life? Why can we confess our unfaithfulness before our God? And here's why. While we are unfaithful, Christ is faithful on our behalf. You see, we can stand before our God in all of our brokenness, knowing that we deserve nothing other than death. But we have a God who loves us, and we have a God who's faithful to us despite our unfaithfulness. We see in the Gospel of Matthew this parallel, this comparison between Judas and Peter, and no doubt we are intended to draw a comparison between the two of them and the way in which they respond. But you know, the story of Peter is set right next to the story of Jesus. You see, Peter faces temptation. It's actually a much lesser temptation than Jesus faces. Peter is questioned by the high priest's servant. Jesus is questioned by the high priest himself. Peter is unfaithful, denies the questioning of the servant girl. Jesus stands up to the greatest temptation, and he remains faithful. You see, what enables Peter to break down in tears is ultimately that Jesus is the one who remains faithful, despite our unfaithfulness. Friends, this is the heart of the Christian faith. No matter what we do, no matter how far we turn away from Jesus, he will never turn away from us. That is seen in the reality that he's willing to go even to the cross, even to die for us. On the cross, we see the open arms of God saying, no matter what you've done, no matter how bad it is, give it to me. I forgive you. You are welcome to be in my presence. But it begins with acknowledging our sin and coming to terms with it. You know, during the season of Advent, which is the season that leads up to Christmas, I believe that's a season in which we're kind of encouraged to vent towards God. It's a season where I like to draw from books like the book of Habakkuk, where Habakkuk just cries out towards God. Why is all of this happening? Habakkuk looks at the injustice and the violence and the dysfunction that is all around him, and he's like, God, where are you? Why are you allowing this to happen? And so Advent is a season in which we're invited to look at the brokenness in our lives, the brokenness in our world, and to cry out to God, to point the finger at God and say, God, why are you allowing this to happen? But the season of Lent, leading up to Easter, now this is a time in which we look at the brokenness in our world. We look at the brokenness in our life. And we point the finger not at God, but at ourselves. This is a season in which we are encouraged to confess. And in that, to find life. Friends, every single one of you is a sinner. Hate to break it to you, this is Lent. This is the season to tell you. If you're new here, if you're visiting, sorry, you picked the wrong time to come. But it's true. And so you need to ask yourself, how am I going to respond? Am I going to respond like the Pharisees? Am I going to respond like Judas? Or in humility and brokenness, like Peter, will I fall at the foot of the cross before the mercy of our God? We now come to our time of communion. What is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity to repent. Communion is an opportunity to confess our sin. The bread and the cup represent the body and the blood of Christ. They point to the reality that we worship a God who is faithful to us even when we are unfaithful. That he's willing to give his life for our sin. And as we take the elements, may we confess our sin and receive his grace that leads to life.